I never thought I'd become the kind of woman who betrays the people she loves most. The kind of woman who lets her own selfish desires blind her to everything else. But here I am. And the worst part? It's not just my husband I betrayed, it's my son. He saw me, he caught me. And now I can't look at him without seeing the disgust in his eyes, without hearing the pain in his voice when he asked me, "Why, Mom? How could you do this to us?" I wish I could take it all back, but some things can't be undone. For most of my marriage, I thought I was happy. I thought we were happy. James and I met young, married young, and built a life together. We had a beautiful home, successful careers, and most importantly, we had our son, Ethan. James was a good man. Stable, dependable, kind. But after years together, the spark faded. Our conversations became about logistics, what bills needed to be paid, what groceries we needed to pick up, what time Ethan's soccer practice was. Somewhere along the way, I started to feel invisible. At first, I told myself it was normal. Every marriage has its ups and downs, right? But then I started noticing other couples, laughing, touching, looking at each other like they couldn't get enough. And I wondered, why don't we have that anymore? I tried to talk to James about it. Do you ever feel like we're just roommates? I asked him one night as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, scrolling through our phones. He shrugged. We're comfortable. Isn't that a good thing? I didn't have an answer for him then. But inside I knew that comfortable wasn't enough for me. That's when I met Lucas. He was a contractor James and I had hired to renovate our kitchen. Tall, confident, with a rough charm that was impossible to ignore. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he talked to you, like nothing else mattered. At first, it was just harmless banter. A compliment here, a joke there. But then it became something more. One afternoon, while James was at work and Ethan was at school, Lucas stayed late to finish up some cabinets. We were alone in the house, and the air between us felt charged, electric. "You're too beautiful to look so sad," he said, his voice low. I should have stopped him. I should have told him to leave. But instead, I let him kiss me. That kiss opened a door I should have kept shut. I told myself it was just a fling, just a distraction from the monotony of my life. But the more time I spent with Lucas, the more I felt like I was coming alive again. He made me feel desired, wanted. Like I was more than just a wife, more than just a mother. But every time I came home to James and Ethan, the guilt would hit me like a tidal wave. I'd see Ethan's smiling face, hear James asking me how my day was, and I'd hate myself for what I was doing. Still, I didn't stop. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. James had gone out of town for a work conference, and Ethan was supposed to be at a friend's house for the afternoon. Lucas and I had planned to meet at a hotel. But at the last minute, he called and said he couldn't get away from work. "Let's meet at your place," he suggested. I hesitated. Bringing him to my home, the home I shared with my family, felt like crossing an invisible line. But I agreed. We were in the living room when it happened. Lucas had his hands on my waist, his lips on my neck, when I heard the sound of the front door opening. My blood turned to ice. Before I could move, before I could say anything, Ethan was standing there, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes wide with shock. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas stepped back, but the damage was already done. The look on Ethan's face will haunt me for the rest of my life. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Who is this?" I tried to explain, to calm him down, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? "Is this why Dad's been so sad lately?" he yelled. "Is this why he doesn't smile anymore?" I froze. I hadn't realized Ethan had noticed. I hadn't realized how much my actions were affecting not just James, but him too. Lucas mumbled something about leaving and slipped out the door, but I barely noticed. All I could focus on was Ethan, his anger, his pain. "How could you do this?" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "How could you do this to Dad, to me?" "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. "You're sorry?" he shot back. "You're sorry? That doesn't fix this, Mom. That doesn't fix anything." He ran upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. I wanted to go after him, to try to explain. But what could I say? That I was bored? That I felt neglected? Nothing I said would make it okay. Nothing I said would erase what he had seen. That night, Ethan refused to come out of his room. When James called to check in, I almost told him everything, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I stayed up all night, replaying the scene in my head over and over. The look on Ethan's face, the sound of his voice when he said, "You broke us." Because he was right, I had broken us. The next morning, Ethan barely looked at me as he grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The silence was unbearable. I tried to text him during the day, but he didn't respond. I thought about calling James, about confessing everything, but the thought of his disappointment, his anger, was too much to bear. When Ethan came home that evening, he went straight to his room. I stood outside his door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, trying to work up the courage to talk to him. Finally, I knocked. "Ethan?" I said softly. "Go away," he replied, his voice muffled. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Just let me explain." There was a long pause before he finally opened the door. "You want to explain?" he said, his eyes red from crying. "Fine. Go ahead." I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. "I made a mistake," I said. "A terrible mistake, and I'm so sorry." "That's it?" he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's all you have to say?" "I never meant to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But you did," he shot back. "You hurt all of us." The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Ethan barely spoke to me, and when James came home, the guilt was suffocating. I knew I had to tell them the truth, but every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. Finally, Ethan forced my hand. One night at dinner, he looked up from his plate and said, "Are you going to tell Dad, or should I?" James froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Tell me what?" he asked, his voice cautious. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. My heart was pounding, my palms slick with sweat. "Mom's been cheating on you," Ethan said bluntly, his eyes fixed on mine. James's face went pale. He looked at me, then back at Ethan, then back at me. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. The silence that followed was deafening. James pushed his chair back and stood up, his expression a mix of anger, pain, and disbelief. "I need some air," he said, grabbing his keys and walking out the door. Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. "I hope it was worth it," he said before storming upstairs. I was left alone in the kitchen, the weight of my actions crushing me. I had betrayed my husband, my son, my family. And for what? A fleeting sense of excitement. A momentary escape from the monotony of my life. It wasn't worth it. None of it was worth it. The hours after James walked out were agonizing. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chairs, replaying Ethan's words over and over in my mind. I hope it was worth it, but it wasn't. God, it wasn't. Nothing about what I'd done felt worth the wreckage I'd caused. I wanted to scream, cry, break something, but none of it would fix what I'd done. I thought about calling James, but what would I even say? That I was sorry? That I regretted it? He already knew that. It didn't change the fact that I betrayed him. Eventually, I forced myself to go upstairs to Ethan's room. I knocked softly on his door, hoping he'd let me in. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, "can we talk?" There was a long silence before he finally opened the door. His face was red and tear-streaked, and the look in his eyes nearly broke me. "I don't want to talk to you," he said, his voice cold. "Please," I begged. "I need you to know how sorry I am." He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Mom. Sorry doesn't change what you did." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "I know I hurt you," I said, "and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand that what happened, it wasn't about you. It wasn't about Dad. It was about me." Ethan's brow furrowed, his anger giving way to confusion. "What do you mean?" I felt lost, I admitted. Like I wasn't enough. Like I wasn't seen. And instead of talking to your dad, instead of dealing with it the right way, I made a terrible mistake. Ethan shook his head, his eyes filling with tears again. "You always told me to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is. You said I should be honest, that I should take responsibility for my actions. But you didn't do any of that." He was right. I had failed him, not just as a wife, but as a mother. "I don't expect you to forgive me," I said softly. But I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to fix this. To fix us. Ethan didn't respond. He just closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, the rejection sinking in like a dagger to my heart. Then I turned and walked back to my room, collapsing onto the bed. For the first time in years, I prayed. I prayed for forgiveness, for strength, for the chance to make things right. James didn't come home that night, or the night after. Each day that passed without hearing from him felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Ethan barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped, distant. I felt like a stranger in my own home. One afternoon, a few days after the confrontation, Ethan came downstairs and dropped his backpack by the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "To Dad's," he said flatly. I blinked, taken aback. He called you." Ethan nodded, avoiding my gaze. "He said I could stay with him for a while." I wanted to argue, to tell him that he should stay home, but I didn't have the right. Not after what I'd done. "Okay," I said quietly. "Just let me know if you need anything, okay?" He didn't respond. He just opened the door and walked out, leaving me alone in the silence. That night, I finally worked up the courage to call James. My hands were shaking as I dialed his number, and when he answered, my heart nearly stopped. "James," I said, my voice breaking, "can we talk?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What's there to talk about?" he said finally. "Everything," I said. "Please. I need to explain." He sighed, and for a moment I thought he was going to hang up. But then he said, "Fine, tomorrow. Noon. At the park?" I agreed, and when he hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. This was my chance to make things right, or at least try to. But what if it wasn't enough? The next day, I sat on a bench at the park, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. When James arrived, he looked different. Tired, yes, but also guarded. Like he had built a wall around himself to keep me out. He sat down on the opposite end of the bench, leaving a wide gap between us. "You wanted to talk," he said, his tone clipped. "So talk." I took a deep breath, my chest tightening. "I'm sorry," I said. "For everything. For betraying you. For hurting Ethan. For breaking our family." James didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," I continued. "But I need you to know that I regret what I did. I regret it more than anything." "Why?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp. "Why did you do it?" I hesitated, struggling to find the words. "I felt lost," I said finally. "I felt like we were drifting apart, like I wasn't enough for you anymore." "Not enough?" he said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to give you and Ethan a good life? To make sure you're happy?" "I know," I said quickly. "And that's why this is on me. It's my fault, James. Not yours." He shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "Do you have any idea what you've done to Ethan, to me? I can't even look at you without seeing him." I felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," I said desperately. "Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just, please don't give up on us." James was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you. But for Ethan's sake, I'm willing to try." My heart leaped at his words, but his next sentence brought me crashing back down. "Things are going to be different," he said. "I'm not coming home right away. And if I find out you're still in contact with him—" "I'm not," I said quickly. "I cut it off. I swear." He nodded, standing up. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "But don't expect this to be easy." "I don't," I said. "Thank you, James. Thank you for giving me another chance." He didn't respond. He just walked away, leaving me sitting on the bench, my heart heavy but hopeful. The road to repairing my family was long and painful. Ethan was distant at first, and James kept me at arm's length. But slowly, through therapy and honest conversations, we began to rebuild. I'll never forget the pain I caused. I'll never forget the look on Ethan's face when he caught me, or the sound of James's voice when he said, "You broke us." But I've learned that while some wounds may never fully heal, love, real, honest love, can still grow in their place.